Hey, I'm Brent Hall, and today I want to talk to you guys about the 3 super ultra most fundamental tips for upping your smartphone photography.
I'm going to use the drift method. Freaking incredible. Round F16 for that to get that sunburst.
And those are exposure, composition, and lighting. And of course, these 3 are like the fundamentals of pretty much all art, but we're applying them to smartphone photography for this purpose. So with these fundamentals down and with these rolling around in your brain, you will definitely immediately take your pictures to the next level. So let's get into how we're going to do that. All right, so the first thing with exposure, what we're talking about is not necessarily what your phone may think is properly exposed, because your phone and or camera is probably an idiot. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't know all the time what you want to focus on. So if you're shooting a picture of a landscape, then a general shot or a general exposure might be okay. But if you're shooting a picture, if you put a person in that landscape, then the person might be too dark. So then you might want to overexpose either the entire thing or make sure that you expose meter properly on your subject. Okay, so I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to go into my camera app and I'm going to take a picture of the beautiful mountains and the city behind me. So right now I'm just in auto mode, and I did that, and it is set to auto HDR, and the auto HDR is kind of a cool feature. However, it doesn't always work right. So as you can see here, I think the shadows are a little too dark. Even though this was in the auto HDR mode, I still think that it didn't do a good enough job boosting those shadows. So then what you can do is, if you're still in auto mode and you want to take the same shot and get your camera to adjust accordingly, then you can just tilt it down a little bit like this. If you tilt it down a little bit to show more of the ground instead of the sky, then it'll meter less for the sky and more for the ground, and that will properly expose more for that. So I'll do that again. All right, so that one is much better in terms of overall exposure. The sky's still not blown out, but the ground is much more exposed. On the downside to that is I had to move the entire phone, the entire camera down, so my composition changed. So now I have much more foreground, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, so the other way to do this and get a proper exposure, or what I'm considering proper for this example, is without sacrificing my composition. If I did want more sky in there, like let's pretend that there was an actual cloud in there, but there's not. So if I did want to keep the exposure of the original image, the composition of the original image, then the next thing you can do is you have to get out of auto. So if your phone has a manual mode, you can go in there and manually control the shutter. And then that will allow you to keep the composition, and then you can decrease the shutter speed. So you have a slower shutter speed, and that will let in more light for your shadowed area. Unfortunately, you can't control the aperture, so the only 2 things you can control for exposure are the shutter speed and the ISO. So that's kind of the basics of exposure, and it works the same when you have action or portraits or anything. Especially with portraits, the phones have a difficult time. If you are just taking a picture of a person standing, especially in a bright scene or something, then you're most likely gonna have to make sure your subject is exposed properly. When you're taking a picture of portraits, it's okay to have a blown out background and have your subject exposed, because that's what you want to show. And sometimes if you can get the background to be properly exposed and your subject without flash or any other lighting, that's cool. But it's okay to blow your background out as long as your subject looks pretty. Composition is the next most important thing, and it's not like one is more important than the other for these 3. These 3 are like a triangle of importance, like a perfect triangle of importance. This is just the way I'm going with them. So composition is extremely important, and knowing some rules of composition that we're going to go over right now is the difference between having a crappy photo, a good photo, or an amazing photo. So the first thing you think about when composition, the most basic rule is the rule of thirds. And that is, picture your frame, whether it's vertical or horizontal, in a grid of thirds. You have thirds horizontally and thirds vertically. So that's going to be 9 squares or 9 pieces. And you want, typically, the rule is you want subjects to be on one of those lines, either the vertical line or the horizontal line, or both. If you have a subject that's on one of the thirds for horizontal and vertical, then that's a double whammy. And those are kind of things that you want. If you have something dead center and something right next to it on a third, that can be kind of psychologically wonky, and that's what we've developed to just perceive that way. So rule of thirds, horizon lines, this horizon here, you don't want 50-50. You don't want half sky, half ground. That's just psychologically, again, that's wonky. Yes, there are times where you can do that, but generally speaking, you want to follow that rule of thirds and put either the sky in the top third or put 2/3 of the sky in, and just have, if you're emphasizing big, beautiful clouds that are not here today at all. Now that's kind of like landscape stuff. Same thing with people. If you want to, especially if you're doing environmental portraits, or if you're, on vacation or whatever, and you're in this beautiful place, you want to take a picture with a person, you don't just get right up to that person and fill the frame with that person, especially if you're wanting to showcase this beautiful landscape. So you want to put that person in a third. Put it either to the left of the third or the right of the third. Yeah, stop putting them in the middle. Just, these are things that we're going to, consciously think about, putting them on thirds. And another thing is, if you have two things in your photo, like a person and a tree or a castle or something, you can put the castle on this side, or the mountain or whatever, and then the person on this side. So going along with the rule of thirds, especially when we're talking about people, there's another psychological effect that is not really conscious, but it's how we've just evolved to perceive things. And that is, when you have a subject either looking into the frame or looking out of the frame. And that depends on which third you put that on. So if you put that on this third here and you have them looking out of the frame, psychologically, that's weird, because there's so much negative space over here and they're looking away from all of that. But if you put them here on the same third and have them look into the frame like this, then you get a much better feeling. For some reason, the disturbance is less. Another super important thing about composition, you don't want lines coming out of your subject. That's wonky. And this is what I mean by this little thing could be the difference between a good photo, a crappy photo, or an amazing photo. So if we do this photo here, there is a big pole coming out of her head. But if we move her just a foot over, no more pole. Doesn't that make you feel better to not see a giant pole coming out of your subject's head? The last thing I want to talk about with composition, and there are a lot more rules to composition, and there are a lot more ways to break these rules and all this stuff, but the other most important thing I want to talk about with composition is leading lines. So what is a leading line? It doesn't have to be an exact line. It can be a curve, it can be a river, it can be a road pushing into the frame, or telling your eyes where to go in that frame. All right, so the last rule on this triangle, the last tip on our super ultra important fundamental triangle tips, is lighting. So lighting is like a whole tutorial, like a whole 10 million hours worth of tutorials by itself. But the thing that I want to get you thinking about is, where is the light in your photo? Okay, this is the most important thing. Whether you're working with natural light, whether you're introducing artificial light, or whether you're doing both, you need to be cognizant of where the light is and what it's doing to your shapes, to your subjects, to your composition, everything. All right, sorry about the harsh transition there. We had to cut it short last night. There's a crazy guy with his dog came around and the sun went away, and we're trying to talk about lighting. So anyways, come back here today. It's the middle of the day. We're in super crappy lighting now, and to further our lighting conversation, we're going to give you some examples on how to fix this. And also I'm going to show you some prettier pictures. So first of all, the first thing you can do when you have harsh lighting like this, you'll notice the sun is behind me, my face is darker. So to compensate for that, either I'm going to overexpose or I'm going to turn around and let the sun hit me in the face. But then the problem is, if I'm not wearing sunglasses, you're going to have issues. I don't want to be squinting, and I don't want my subjects to be squinting when I'm trying to take pictures of them. So the next best thing you can do is, if you don't want to overexpose because you don't want to lose the background, then let's go find some shade. And so there's some trees right here, so let's hop into the shade. All right, we're in the shade now. Should look much better. My face is smoothed out. It's a more proper exposure overall because the camera is metering for this overall shady area. So we're going to take those same principles and we're going to apply them to the phone, and we're going to apply them to shooting our model or your family or yourself or whatever it is we're shooting. So let's go. There's a really nice mural back here, and let's go put the subject, the model, against the wall, and we'll show you the crappy one and the good one. No bueno. Muy bueno. Okay, so we're downtown. This is a perfect spot, perfect place, perfect time to talk about exposure. So if I want to take a picture of this really cool downtown area, like let's say I want to shoot this Gila thing in the background here, the theater. Well, the problem is there's shadow because the sun's on the wrong side. So I either have to overexpose everything like this, or I can switch sides. If I run across the street, then I can get a picture of this other cool building that's down here, and the sun is lighting up this whole face. So that's gonna look a lot better than this side, which is all in the shadows. If I want this specific shot, then I can adjust my exposure to make sure that this is exposed properly. The sky will be a little blown out, the road might be a little blown out, but that's okay if I'm trying to shoot this exact Gila theater. Okay, so this goes under both categories of exposure and lighting. And in order to get the right exposure, I have to think about where the light's coming from. So for this shot, when I'm shooting at this cool building over here, that looks better, and I have to think about the light. The sun is shining more on this one than it is on this one. So I have to take that into consideration when I'm composing my image. Okay, so once I figured out my lighting, then I have to figure out my exposure. So now I know where the sun is coming from, and now I have to figure out my exposure. And for this side, everything's all kind of the same exposure, so it's gonna work fine. But if like I said, if I wanna shoot this thing, then I have to decide, do I wanna blow the sky out, or do I want this to be a little darker? All right, here's another compositional. This is a perfect example how I'm standing for compositional issues. Okay, so this is where I might tell you that we're gonna break the rule of thirds, because I just told you try to stay in the rule of thirds. But if you'll notice, I'm standing dead center. The reason for that is, you can probably see, is we have leading lines, and those are those things that we're talking about that can lead your eyes into or out of the photo depending on what you want to show. Well, these here are perfect leading lines, and I want to have symmetry with them, so I'm standing right in the middle, and I'm going to do that while I'm shooting as well. So here's what that looks like. Okay, lighting wise, if you notice, again, I'm completely backlit, so the sun is mostly over there. We're mostly in the shade, which is helping the overall exposure, but we're focusing on me. And because I'm backlit, me or the subject, the model that I'm gonna shoot here, is gonna be, this side of us is gonna be completely in the shade, and there's not gonna be any splotches or anything like that. So the lighting is gonna be nice and even, and then it'll be a better exposure. We are gonna have some blown out areas in the highlights, but like I said, that's okay, because we're focused on this area, and we have these beautiful leading lines, and we don't care if there's a couple of things that are blown out. All right, so that's it. That's it for this tutorial. That's the 3 super ultra most important fundamentals of shooting. And like I said, this can apply to, we're applying it to smartphones, but it applies to everything. So you keep these 3 fundamentals in mind, and you're gonna always up your photography game, no matter what you're shooting on, when you're shooting, or where you're shooting. So if you like this kind of stuff and you want to see more, definitely make sure you subscribe to my channel. Check out the rest of my tutorials. If you really want to up your stuff and you want to check out even more personal tutorials and stuff like that, go check out my Patreon site. The link's in the description below. If you have any questions or comments about any of the technical stuff or anything you want to know, make sure you leave those in the comments below and I'll get back to you on those. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Ooh, I just remembered, I didn't mention it before in the video. I totally just spaced it, but everything in this video, all the images were shot with my cell phone, which is the Samsung Galaxy Note 8. So just wanted to make that clear, and now we're done.